Hello, welcome to another episode of Upstate Archives. My name is Kristina. I'm a digital producer here at News 10, and every week I sit down with local experts to dive into the Capital Region's fascinating history. This week we will be taking a little bit of a heavier turn and talking about the Schenectady Massacre, and I'm joined by Michael Diana from the Schenectady County Historical Society. You're an educator there, is that right?
Yeah, well, technically I'm the director of education.
Oh, wow.
And the historian. There's a very lofty title, but I try not to take myself too seriously.
Of course. Well, thank you so much for coming today.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. So I want to start this topic. Obviously, it's one of the, I think, heaviest ones that I've had on this show so far. And from my understanding, the massacre itself occurred on February 8th, 1690. Is that correct?
That's right. Yep.
Yeah. But it seems like there's a lot more we should talk about that happened before the massacre itself to kind of understand what happened. So would you be able to sort of give us a little bit of an introduction into the historical context around that time and what was really going on?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you asked because so very often the massacre is kind of treated in these very simplistic terms, just like this crazy, horrible thing that happened. But there's really nearly a century of preamble to this horrible night in Schenectady's history. And basically what you have is you have several different groups vying for control here in what is now the northeast of the United States of America. But, of course, back then was a completely different political and cultural scene. This was the colonial period, and you had various different European groups vying for control here. You had various different Native American groups vying for control here, and there would be a lot of conflict that predates the massacre and leads up to the massacre itself.
I see. So who were the main players during this time period? Like, who were I don't want to say like the main groups in control, but the main groups that were, I guess, most influential at the time?
Sure. So we'll start with Schenectady, right? Schenectady and Albany had been founded by Dutch settlers earlier in the century, but by this point in time, the Dutch colony had been taken over by the British. So it's now the colony of New York, part of the British Empire, and of course the British have many colonies in North America, and New York is just one of them. But there's also the French. The French have a colony up along the St. Lawrence River. Think about like Montreal and Quebec, right? Those settlements would be the principal settlements of this French colony. And they're going to be a big part of this drama as well. We should also talk about the Haudenosaunee, or as they're often called, the Iroquois. They never called themselves the Iroquois until a bunch of people started calling them the Iroquois, but they always called themselves the Haudenosaunee, the people of the Longhouse. And that is actually, you could say, a confederacy of 5 different Native American nations who had joined together. They had been in this area for hundreds of years before the Dutch or the English or the French ever showed up. Now later there would be a 6th nation that joins, but we're not in that part of the timeline yet. So it's the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, the Seneca. These 5 nations of the Haudenosaunee, and they're going to be very important for this story as well. Lastly, maybe we should mention that there were Iroquois people who were allied with the French, who the French had sort of kind of convinced to resettle in Montreal or around Montreal. So you do have people who are culturally linked to the Haudenosaunee, but who have kind of politically reoriented themselves towards the French colony. The French would call these people the Salt. But these are kind of like, you might think of them as Iroquois expatriates relocated to a different place and kind of no longer part of the 5 nations, the confederacy itself. They're kind of following along with what the French want them to do.
Okay. Why did they decide to do that, to ally with the French?
Well, this has been a longstanding point of tension between the Haudenosaunee themselves, the Confederacy, and the French colony. The French were very vigorous in their proselytization efforts, right? This is the 17th century, a big battle between Catholics and Protestants to spread their word throughout the world. And so French Jesuit priests throughout the 17th century were making strong efforts to convert Iroquoian people. and not just convert them, but also kind of convince them to come back to France, because the Jesuits figured that if these Haudenosaunee people are living in their traditional villages, they'll just continue to do the traditional things which don't align with what their view of Christianity ought to be.
Right.
So the Jesuits really want these people to come back with them to Montreal to live as good. They called them praying Indians, or Caughnawagas, back then. So that was kind of a goal of the French administration up in Canada. Now, of course, this caused great tension with the Haudenosaunee, because the Haudenosaunee don't want their people going up to New France. They don't want them to be spirited away to this new place and kind of lose the connection and traditional obligations that they would otherwise fulfill. So this was just one of many points of conflict between the Haudenosaunee themselves and the French.
Right, absolutely. So we have some of the Haudenosaunee allied with the French. What were some other alliances that were formed during this time that were sort of impactful and influential?
Maybe not so much for Schenectady's story and the massacre, but the French also had a powerful ally in the Wabanaki Confederacy. Because the massacre isn't just some isolated incident, right? It's part of this great war that's going on in America and also in Europe. And a lot of the conflict would happen not in the colony of New York, but really kind of in the border regions of Massachusetts and New Hampshire and Maine, where English settlements were kind of growing and encroaching into Wabanaki territory. And French and Wabanaki forces would be raiding along that area as well. That's probably where most of the action actually took place in the American theater. If you really want to get pedantic, of course, there's this whole big bloody war going on in Europe with Louis XIV. He's fighting against a grand coalition of other European powers, including the English and the Dutch and the German principalities of the Holy Roman Empire. So this real big, nasty mess going on in Europe as well. It's essentially a global conflict, and Schenectady is just one part of this cycle of violence.
Wow. So there's a lot going on at this time. Tell us a little bit about the turning points that brought us to the Schenectady Massacre specifically.
Yeah. So the Haudenosaunee had long been allied with the British. You'd say they had a military and economic partnership. And the Mohawks would be the closest allied to, or closest in contact to Albany and Schenectady, because they are the easternmost of the Five Nations. So they're very much involved with what's going on in Albany and in Schenectady. And as part of the long-standing conflict between the Haudenosaunee and the French, well, the French had spent a lot of the 1670s attacking Haudenosaunee settlements. They destroyed several Seneca villages on the other end of the Confederacy. And drove the people from their homes there. So, of course, the Five Nations have a real grievance against the French. And in 1689, they decide to take revenge for the French attacks on their homeland. And they actually go up to just outside of Montreal was a small town called Lachine, and the Mohawks destroy that town of Lachine, and they kill a bunch of people up there. Again, kind of this cycle of violence continuing to churn and people getting caught in the crossfire. And it's that attack on Lachine in late of 1689, which would be the impetus for the French and their native allies to counterattack, and would kind of send them on their journey to Schenectady just a few months later.
So there's a lot of attacking, clearly.
Yes.
What exactly was the point of all the violence? Like, what was the main goal other than response to other violence that had happened?
Yeah, sure. I mean, ultimately, it really was kind of just senseless violence. Very little strategic goals were accomplished in the whole of this war. Underlying tensions revolved around the fur trade. Okay. The English wanted to control the fur trade. The French wanted to control the fur trade, right? Because these furs, like beaver pelts or otter pelts or any kind of pelt, really, any kind of fur, would be very valuable back in Europe. So these different European groups wanted to control that as much as they could. Meanwhile, different Native American groups wanted to be kind of the main providers of furs to European trade partners. And the Haudenosaunee, the Five Nations of the Haudenosaunee, had done a pretty remarkable job of expanding their power and influence against other neighboring native groups, which ultimately brought them into conflict with the French, right? Because they had kind of encroached upon some native peoples that were allied with the French, and that was another reason for this long-standing conflict between the Iroquois and the French.
Absolutely. Okay. No, that makes sense. And pivoting us specifically towards Schenectady, tell us a little bit about who lived in Schenectady at this time. What was the population looking like? What did the city itself look like?
Sure. Well, I mean, city is too generous a term for this early point in Schenectady's history. Schenectady had been founded in 1661, really as like a satellite of Albany, or Beverwyck, as the Dutch had called it. It was still technically a Dutch colony in 1661 when Schenectady was founded. The English would show up just a few short years later in 1664, and that's when the English took over. So it's a small little stockaded town. So there's a little palisade wooden wall surrounding the town. It's not some grand fortification, this stockade, but it's better than nothing. There might be, well, according to some accounts, there were 80 houses in the town of Schenectady. That might be a little bit of an over-exaggeration. That might be too high a number, because as best as we can tell, the population of Schenectady was about 150, maybe a little bit more than that. And who are these people? Well, the town is still predominantly Dutch, because most of the people who came there in 1661 were, at least, the majority of them were Dutch. There would be other folks as well, like the famous Glenn family. They'll show up later in this drama. They were Scottish, but even people who were not ethnically Dutch were culturally Dutch. They spoke Dutch. They ate Dutch food. They built Dutch-style houses. The culture was predominantly Dutch, even though the English had taken over some time ago.
Gotcha.
There would also be, though, it's not just Dutch people and maybe a small number of British people showing up. There would also be Haudenosaunee people, right? Like Mohawk people would often be in Schenectady and Albany, staying for long periods of time as part of this trade and diplomacy that's going on between the Five Nations and the English colony of New York. The main point of contact is Schenectady and Albany. So you have Haudenosaunee people in those towns on a very frequent basis. A word might also be said for enslaved people. A lot of people don't think about slavery in the colony of New York, but unfortunately that was very much a big institution. And there would be dozens of enslaved people in Schenectady on the night of the massacre as well.
Okay, so we have a lot of different groups here in the play. And I want to kind of pivot to this this picture that you sent me.
Oh, sure.
Give us a little bit of details about this photo. I think what was important to me is you sent over some details when I had asked for these photos and said that this actually isn't a primary source.
That's right.
So tell us a little bit about this photo. I just want to make it clear to anyone who's viewing that, it might not be It's not a primary source.
Unfortunately. No, there really are no primary sources. No one, I guess, deemed it necessary or worthwhile to sit down and paint Schenectady in the 17th century, which is too bad for us. This is a modern commission. Folks might be familiar with Len Tentillo, kind of the famous painter of historic landscapes. Well, this painting was commissioned from him very recently. Gosh, what was it, like 2024? Like I'm losing track of my own life now. But this was just a couple of years ago that Len Tentillo presented us with this painting. And he's a great historian. He's a great artist. So while it's not a primary source, he goes through the primary sources as best as he's able to reconstruct these scenes. So this is Len Tentillo's depiction of Schenectady in the 17th century, generally what it would have looked like. And what you'll see, first and foremost, is that Schenectady was a river port. People don't really think of Schenectady as being a port today, but historically it was. It's the easternmost port of navigation on the Mohawk River.
Oh, wow.
Any further east of that, of Schenectady, you start to get into some rougher waters, like think Cohoes Falls, for instance, right?
Yeah.
You don't want to be putting your boat in around Cohoes Falls, right? Schenectady is the first safest place to put a boat in the water on the Mohawk River. And so it serves as this important transportation break with anything that wants to go to the west, or anyone who wants to go to the west has to start their journey in Schenectady. And anyone who's coming from the west towards the east, they're going to come down the Mohawk River. They're going to come to Schenectady. And in 1690, this is generally the Mohawk people themselves, the Haudenosaunee themselves, coming to Schenectady to trade and to barter.
Gotcha. Okay, well, thank you so much for that explanation. I think that gives us a lot of sort of context for a lot of the the photos, or I guess another one of the photos that we'll be seeing later today. But I think this is a good time to go to our first break. Stick with us. Welcome to Upstate Archives. Thank you for sticking with us. I've been joined here today with Michael Diana from the Schenectady County Historical Society. We've been looking into the Schenectady Massacre, which just celebrated its anniversary on February 8th. Let's start to really, I guess, just go towards the night of the massacre. What was the original plan leading up to this event? Why did they decide to strike Schenectady specifically?
Yeah. So you have to go back to January of that year, which is when this attacking party actually leaves the vicinity of Montreal. It's about 120 Frenchmen and about 80 or so native warriors. And again, these native warriors are a combination of predominantly these Sault Indians, these kind of expatriate Haudenosaunee, and there's a few other folks in there from different cultural groups as well. So they leave in January of 1690. Again, their goal is to take revenge for the Mohawk attack against Lachine, but they're going to attack the English because the English, according to the French, are going to be an easier target, I'd say. And the French, if they can destroy Albany, they can sever the relationship, they can sever that connection between the Haudenosaunee and their English allies, and maybe that could actually bring the Haudenosaunee over to the French side of things, which would be a huge strategic victory for the French, something they'd strove to achieve for nearly a century. They'd wanted to accomplish this. So these attackers, they're leaving Montreal, and they're originally going to attack Albany. But you got to imagine the journey that they had to go through to get to this area, right? We're talking like 250 miles of walking through snow and ice and sleet and walking over frozen Lake Champlain and down the frozen Hudson River, the upper Hudson. It must have been an absolutely grueling journey. And I don't know that I would say it's commendable, but it's certainly impressive that they went to all these great lengths, this Herculean effort to take this bloody revenge that they wanted to take. Now, as they started to get closer and closer to Albany itself, they started to have second thoughts. Right? Albany is a decently large town. It has a decent-sized fort protecting the town. And there's really only like 200 of these Canadian attackers here. And they're pretty tired from this long, grueling journey. And they realize they don't have the wherewithal to attack a large settlement like Albany. But they came all this way. They can't leave without massacring somebody, right? So instead, they know of the small little town of Schenectady. And it's a much smaller town, smaller population, smaller militia to garrison it. And there is a small little blockhouse that protects the town, but it's nowhere near the size and scale of the fort that protects Albany. Right. So just a little bit north of Albany, they start to take a detour around to the west towards little old Schenectady. They descend upon the village. Now, the village of Schenectady is completely unaware that anything is happening. It's the deep winter, right? So it would be pretty unlikely that anyone is going to show up, right? The people of Schenectady, they know that there's this war going on. They know that they're part of this broad conflict that's going on. But who on earth would be so crazy, so bold to come in the dead of winter to attack them? So there really isn't much preparedness in the town of Schenectady. And further complicating things, maybe this is pedantic and unnecessary, but there's this political dispute going on between Albany and Schenectady as well. It's something called the Leislerian crisis, which I don't think we have to really get into here and now. All you need to know is that the colony of New York was split between who the rightful governor should be. Right. The people of Schenectady were in favor of this guy named Jacob Leisler. The people in Albany really didn't like Jacob Leisler at all. And so Albany and Schenectady have a little bit of a falling out in the lead up to the massacre. So there's no Albany militiamen welcome in the town of Schenectady. Instead, there's just 13 militiamen from the colony of Connecticut. Why are they from Connecticut? It's a long story. And they're the ones on guard that night. But even they were asleep on the fateful night.
Right. No. Okay. And we have another photo here by Len Tintillo. And this is what it might have looked like that night or around that night or so.
Well, yeah, right. So you can see by the snow that this is a winter scene of Schenectady just before the massacre. And Len Tintillo, this was actually one of the first paintings that was commissioned from Len Tintillo of Schenectady. So we've had this painting in our collection for some time now. It's and it kind of hangs up in our museum. So you can see that it's still a pretty small town. In this image, you can see the little mill that would serve the community for grinding wheat flour. You can see in the middle of the picture there's a small little Dutch church there, and you can see these small little Dutch-style dwellings which would have defined the town at that time. And this is very likely the best visual that we would have for what the French and the native Canadians would see as they approach Schenectady.
Gotcha. Okay. So, I mean, now to get to kind of the most heavy parts of this.
Yeah.
How many people died as a result of this massacre, and what came of those who may have survived? Were they, taken hostage, or were there refugees or anything like that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, massacre really is an appropriate term for what happened, because the French and the natives, they were able to infiltrate the town. The gate was left unlocked, so there was really no difficulty in them getting in, and everyone is asleep. No one is on guard. No one is looking out for any trouble. So at the given signal, the attack commences, and it really is quite brutal. Doors are kicked in, and these bloodthirsty attackers are setting upon people in their own homes before they have time to arm themselves or dress themselves or even figure out what the heck is going on. And no one is really spared. Men, women, children are killed. We have specific primary sources that show that even babies were killed in some pretty gruesome fashions as well. The Dutch minister was killed, and the church was burned to the ground. The French had specific orders not to do that, but in the confusion and the chaos and the darkness of that night, they got, I guess, a little bit carried away and killed the Dutch minister as well. So really, no quarter was given to the people in Schenectady on that night. 60 people in total were killed.
Okay, 60.
A further 27 were taken captive and taken back to Canada. The only people who were spared, actually, I should point out, there were about 20-some-odd Mohawk people in the village of Schenectady that night, and the Mohawks were spared. Now, that might seem a little bit counterintuitive because, remember, the French are here to take revenge for a Mohawk attack on one of their villages. So why are the Mohawks being spared? Well, again, it's probably because a large portion of this invading force are Sault people, these expatriate Haudenosaunee who don't want to kill their distant cousins, right? They still maintain this personal and familial relationship with the people back in the Five Nations, and they don't want to be spilling the blood of these people. So the Mohawks actually are spared because of this connection between them and these Sault Indians.
Right, absolutely. And I want to sort of pivot to this photo specifically. You had mentioned earlier that there were 80 Native Americans who were a part of this attack, but it seems like in this photo we see only Native Americans that are doing this.
Yeah, this painting is definitely a product of its time. And by that, I mean 1836. It was painted by a guy named Samuel Sexton. Now, of course, 1836, that's like 140 years after the massacre itself. Samuel Sexton was not a historian. He did not really know the finer points of what happened on that night. I'm sure he had heard some stories, old wives' tales that had been passed down through the people of Schenectady. And I don't know if it was a conscious choice of his, but in his depiction, it's just Native Americans doing the attacking. There's a lot of different factual inaccuracies I could pick out from this painting here. Even like silly things like, look at what those Native attackers, these Native caricatures are wearing. They're like wearing these thigh-length tunics. That's not what they would be wearing on a cold February night in 1690. So there's a lot of factual inaccuracies with this painting. That being said, this image is perhaps still the defining image of the massacre, right? It still kind of has this influence even on people today about what the massacre would look like. So very often people come in and they ask me about, the Indians and the massacre. But that's really just, I think, a product of this kind of bad historiography that has surrounded the massacre for the last 200 years or so.
Right. No, absolutely. No, that makes sense. And, after the massacre or even during, was there any sort of response or retaliation to the attack? Was there anyone that was trying to warn or let Albany know that this was happening?
Oh, sure. Some folks in Schenectady might know the somewhat famous tale of Simon Skirmerhorn. Simon Skirmerhorn, he was able to escape his dwelling and find a horse, and he's galloping out of the stockade to warn the people of Albany. He actually he gets shot through the thigh. Oh, wow. One of the attackers was able to shoot him through the thigh, but he's able to continue on, and he has to take the road through kind of what is now modern-day Niskayuna, which is not the most direct way to Albany, but in the chaos and confusion, he had to take what was available to him. And so it's a long 6-hour journey via horseback. Wow. You got to imagine his thigh is bleeding profusely. His horse was wounded as well, and the horse is bleeding profusely. And he makes it to Albany, exhausted and half frostbitten. His horse collapses and dies just right there from exhaustion and the wound. And Simon Skirmerhorn is able to warn the people of Albany, hey, there's this attack going on. And the people of Albany are able to raise some militia to go and respond, but not in time, right? There's also a guy named Lawrence. Lawrence is a Mohawk man, and Lawrence is probably not what his mama named him, but Lawrence is like a European name that he would use in European company, right? And he was very often in Albany. He was a good friend of an Albany minister named Godfrilius Delius, who worked to translate the Bible into the Mohawk language. So Lawrence is a familiar sight in Schenectady and Albany, and Lawrence goes to see the ruins of Schenectady the next day. And he's very much aggrieved to see this, and he and some of his fellow Mohawks, they assemble about 150 Mohawk warriors and 50 Albany militiamen. And this large force goes out after the retreating attackers, right? The French and their native allies, they're making their way back to Montreal. They don't want to stick around for whatever response is going to come their way. But they're laden down with plunder and prisoners, so they're not moving very fast. Lawrence, his fellow warriors, and the Albany men are able to catch up to the retreating Canadians and inflict some retaliatory losses, which I don't know, maybe made them feel a little bit better, but ultimately it probably didn't solve any of the problems that the massacre created.
Right. No, that makes sense. And I feel like there's just so much to talk about this massacre, and we don't have that much. I think we could talk about it all day.
We probably could, yeah.
And unfortunately, it's only a 30-minute episode. But I guess the last question, at least for during that time, how did this attack impact local politics at all, if it did? What was sort of the larger impact on the historical context of the time?
Sure. I wish I could say that a lesson was learned by the massacre, but it really wasn't. The English colony of New York was pretty poorly led at this time, and of course the horror of the massacre, the people of New York really wanted to respond somehow. The English government in general wanted to respond somehow. And the Mohawks are kind of encouraging their English allies, hey, now that your blood has been spilled, we've been dealing with the French for so long. Let's go together. Let's drive the French from Canada. Let's finally solve this problem. But the counterattack that was organized by the English colonial officials went absolutely nowhere. It was poorly led. It was poorly organized. Some diseases actually swept through the preparing force. So there really was, unfortunately, no lesson learned. And King William's War, as it's known, this broader conflict, just continued on apace. There was other massacres, there was other violent incidents that happened, but I really don't think that anyone learned a lesson or altered their behavior in any way. The English didn't really support the Mohawks any better in this conflict with the French. Unfortunately, it's just kind of a senseless night of violence.
Right. No, absolutely. That's just devastating. And, to bring us back to today, to the present day, what are some research efforts that are going on? Are we still learning about what happened that night? Are we still recovering any victims?
There hasn't been any new breakthroughs or developments in the massacre recently. I would say what has changed more is kind of like the interpretation of the massacre. Because again, maybe even like 50 years ago, the predominant image of the massacre would be what Samuel Sexton painted back in 1836. Again, this just savage Indian attack on good Christian peoples here in the colonies. What we're trying to do at the Historical Society is, again, really recontextualize this massacre, situate it in this broader Machiavellian geopolitical contest that's happening in the 17th century.
Right.
As for the facts of the matter, I don't know that there's any more revelations waiting to be found. But hey, you never know, right? There's always new discoveries in Schenectady. You're always, finding things below the surface of the stockade. In fact, relatively recently, at the turn of the 20th century, some human remains were found, and I guess that's the picture that we have up there on the screen. Those human remains are believed to have been from the massacre. Wow. I don't know that I can prove that here and now, but that's kind of the general belief about those human remains. So maybe we'll find something new, if someone just digging in their garden in the stockade might uncover something that redefines our understanding of the massacre itself.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, like I said, I feel like we could just spend all day talking about this.
We certainly could.
But unfortunately, we've hit time. Thank you so much for joining me today, Michael. I really appreciate it. I've learned a lot.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Of course. And thank you all so much for joining us for another episode of Upstate Archives. We'll see you next week.